Welcome to our Copper Alliance podcast program, Copper and Fish Smell, Who Knows? Despite the play on the word knows, if you haven't already guessed, this podcast is about copper and olfaction, or a fish's sense of smell. By that I mean not how a fish smells, but how a fish uses its sense of smell. My name is Scott Baker. I'm the Director of Health, Environment, and Sustainable Development for the International Copper Association. Today I'll be joined by my colleague Joe Gorsuch, Manager of Health, Environment, and Sustainable Development for the Copper Development Association in North America. Joe has invited two science experts to participate in our discussion, and together we will examine the copper and olfaction issue based on sound research, study, and analysis. But before launching into the scientific facts about copper and olfaction in fish, I'd like to provide some background information about odor and scent trails in fish, specifically in salmon and trout. Fish activities, like the location of food sources, predator avoidance, homing, and spawning, are dependent on olfaction. Impairment of the fish olfactory system or its sense of smell will threaten its survival. Some scientists theorize that contaminants found in stormwater from highways and parking lots are scrambling a salmon's homing abilities. As a result of stormwater testing, a ban on copper's use in brake pads has been imposed. Although there are many variables that could damage salmon populations, copper was originally cited by some scientists in the U.S. Pacific Northwest as the main source of toxicity and thus olfactory impairment in salmon. Concerns are now expressed by regulators on the U.S. West Coast that short-term exposures to very low copper concentrations, even below current regulatory limits, might impair olfaction and or possibly behavior in fish, particularly in salmon. Joe Gorsuch has been working on this issue for many months.
That's right, Scott. In this podcast, we will evaluate the effect of copper on salmon olfactory impairment. We will examine the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's, or NOAA for short, recent inclusion of metals and other contaminants as potential sources of olfactory impairment in salmon. Although this sounds like a bad news story for copper, science experts on today's program will help to shed light on this complex topic. We will talk about the work we are doing through our science outreach programs to counter misperceptions about copper and fish, more specifically salmon.
Okay, Joe, but before we take a deep dive into the sensibilities of salmon, I'd like to welcome Gerald Turner, Director of Communications for ICA, who will facilitate our panel discussion. Gerald?
Hi, Scott and Joe. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this podcast. I am looking forward to learning more about olfaction in fish and how it relates to copper. You know, although salmon may be cold-blooded, apparently they are not insensitive.
To smell or not to smell? That is the question.
Seriously, we know that both fresh and seawater, in fact, all bodies of water that sustain life, contain copper as a vital natural element. Copper, simply stated, is indispensable because it is necessary for normal growth in living beings, including fish. So copper's existence in water sources as a natural element isn't being questioned, is it?
No, you're right. It's not. Copper is an essential trace element, and an adequate supply is necessary for normal metabolism in fish, in aquatic plants, and let's not forget about humans. Levels of copper in fresh and salt water have been found to be generally low. Copper is an effective nutrient that is essential in small quantities.
So let's start with the primary question. Who knows about copper and fish smell? We know that the ICA and CDA are committed to pursuing and relying on accurate, objective science around a number of environmental issues and ensuring that copper's use is safe and appropriate for people, wildlife, and our planet. This means there's a lot of ground or underwater investigative work happening in support of copper's many uses. To this end, Scott and Joe collaborate with a number of international science and technical experts who are familiar with the environmental challenges our industry faces. Also joining us today are two highly respected scientists whose specific contributions to the body of knowledge on aquatic toxicology are substantial and very helpful to the copper industry. Joe, would you please introduce our guests?
Thanks, Gerald. I'd love to. As you mentioned, Scott and I have the privilege of working on behalf of the Copper Alliance with many knowledgeable and talented scientists who are renowned for their work in aquatic toxicology, which, by the way, is the study of how chemicals affect fish and other aquatic organisms. I'd like to introduce our program co-producer, David DeForest, who, along with the ICA, has made this podcast possible. Although David will not be participating in our panel discussions today, he has collaborated with me and Scott on the contents of this program, as well as in numerous studies and papers of interest to the copper and science communities. David is an environmental toxicologist with Windward Environmental, an environmental consulting firm in Seattle, Washington. David supports the metals and mining industry in its ongoing efforts to develop and recommend updated water quality criteria for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. David's work has been instrumental to the success of many studies and symposia Scott and I have sponsored on behalf of the ICA and CDA.
And a big thanks to David for his significant contributions to developing sound science and his steadfast educational outreach to the scientific community.
Dr. Joe Meyer, who is on our panel of discussions today, has also authored several important studies that counter what we call scientifically unjustifiable concerns about the fate and effects of copper as it relates to aquatic organisms. Joe Meyer is a technical expert for Arcadis, an international consultancy, design, engineering, and management services firm. He is an aquatic ecotoxicologist and biogeochemist, a retired zoology professor from the University of Wyoming, and former director of the Red Buttes Environmental Research Laboratory. Joe's expertise contributes to the ICA and CDA's understanding of metal mixtures and water quality issues. Joe joins us from Golden, Colorado. Later in this program, we'll talk about the significance of recent scientific papers authored by Joe Meyer, David DeForest, and their science colleagues. These papers further support the use of copper in roofing and other building construction applications and in anti-fouling paint used on ship and boat hull. Thanks for being with us today, Joe.
Well, thanks for inviting me to participate, Joe.
Dr. Robert Genzimer also joins us from Colorado. Bob is a vice president and senior ecotoxicologist at GEI Consultants, a consulting firm providing geotechnical, environmental, water resources, and ecological solutions. Bob manages projects involving the development and regulatory implementation of site-specific water quality standards, metals and toxicology, and the development of new water quality criteria, and conducts land and aquatic ecological risk assessments. Bob's recent work with us includes advocating the use of the biotic ligand model, which we refer to as the bioavailability model, or the BLM, for development of aquatic life protection criteria. This is an important tool for the copper industry. More about the BLM and the technical support that Bob and GI are providing to every state later in this program. Bob, welcome.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here.
Okay, let's get this started by talking about aquatic life in copper. Scott, who knows, as in olfactory?
Well, if you were able to picture a fish's nose, the terms olfaction and olfactory refer to the sense of smell, detected by a small cluster of nerve cells housed in the nasal cavity of most mammals and fish. It's also in the antennae of insects and invertebrates. But in this program, we are focusing on water quality in fish. And we know that copper can alter the ability of a fish to smell and therefore alter their behavior.
Regarding behavior, Joe Gorsuch, can you speak a little bit about copper avoidance and fish smell?
Sure can. Copper in the sense of smell in fish is not new. Studies conducted during World War II determined that a form of copper could be used as a shark repellent. This was important research for the Navy and in turn saved lives.
It's interesting, Joe, to note that one of the people who was central to the development of the shark repellent was none other than America's favorite chef, Julia Childs. She was working with the Office of Strategic Services during World War II and was a very effective spy at the time, posing as a secretary. But it turns out her very first culinary recipe was the shark repellent that she mixed in her bathtub. The result was called a shark chaser, which was a mix of black dye and copper acetate bound up in a water-soluble wax that was used by the Navy throughout World War II and all the way up into the Vietnam War. While it was not a particularly effective repellent at the time, it just shows that culinary skills can be used in many ways.
Well, Bob, it seemed to have worked well in the test kitchen, but not so well with the shark's palate. Interesting, though. Why should the copper industry care about fish olfactory responses today? Scott, can you speak to that?
Sure. Concerns about olfactory impairment, justifiably or not, could lead to increased government regulation on diffuse sources of copper such as roof runoff. In the worst-case scenario, it could, and in fact has, impacted government policies, legislation, and additional bans on copper-containing materials.
Exactly, Scott. For example, the following is a brief history about NOAA's involvement in this activity. Their first paper, published in 2003, was spurred through interest in stormwater, where they conducted a look at the effects of stormwater on fish, in particular salmon. This led to the connection of copper being made through this stormwater study. In 2008, another paper that was published was based on research that NOAA did, alleging that copper reduces salmon populations due to olfactory impairment. NOAA's study results led to more stringent regulations, such as overly restrictive copper benchmarks for stormwater discharges and the banning of copper in brake pads.
Okay, well, I'm sure that you're going to answer this question later, but if there's regulations in place, why is this still a discussion point? And also, why are salmon getting so much attention in these studies? Joe Meyer, I understand this is your area of expertise, so if you could educate us.
Well, laboratory experiments have demonstrated that in laboratory waters, low concentrations of copper can affect olfaction in salmon and trout. And in higher concentrations of copper, the olfactory nerve cells can even be killed. Therefore, copper can affect fish behavior. By that I mean migration or feeding or detection of predators by the fish. As a result, scientists and the general public have become concerned. However, we need to recognize that the water used in most of the laboratory experiments represents a generally overly protective scenario. And by laboratory water, I mean water that is simplified compared to real-world waters. And this difference in water chemistry between the laboratory and real-world waters matters, because the more you have some of those chemicals in the real-world waters, the more protection you have against the toxicity of copper and other metals. Therefore, waters used in lab tests make copper appear more toxic than it would in real-world waters. But to summarize, salmon are receiving attention because the experiments that were conducted in lab waters have led the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state agencies, and some citizen groups to infer that salmon stocks in the Pacific Northwest are being impacted by copper-caused olfactory impairment, even at low copper concentrations.
And as you know, Joe, one of the main reasons this is a primary concern is that many salmon populations, particularly in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, are considered threatened or endangered. Because of this, these potential depletions of the stock or size of these populations are a potential concern under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, or ESA. Because of a lot of the work that you just mentioned, stormwater in urban and suburban areas with salmon-bearing streams are becoming implicated as causing many of these declines. This is an economic, recreational, and culturally important issue because salmon are very important. Many people make their living from salmon, and they taste quite good, too.
Thanks, Bob. What other factors may cause the salmon population to decline?
Probably the chief factor is habitat loss, resulting from activities such as damming of rivers and other modifications to streams in urban and suburban areas. Also widely implicated is overfishing of the populations and chemicals from urban runoff other than metals, but researchers don't quite yet know what they are or how significant their effects might be. Ultimately, it's not correct to assume or perceive that copper by itself is the culprit in the loss of populations. These other factors clearly play a role.
To proceed to part 2, please click on the button now.